All right, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm sure folks will still be trickling in, but let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot of information to cover. Again, thank you so much for joining us today on our presentation on the New York City Funds Tracker, How Fiscal Trends Shape the City's Future. My name is Madeline Naley, and I'm the Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Research here at FPWA. FPWA is a leading anti-poverty, social policy, and advocacy organization dedicated to strengthening human services organizations, faith institutions, and advancing economic security and justice for all New Yorkers. The New York City Funds Tracker was designed to help advocates understand and explore the city's budget. We have an online dashboard and prepare reports explaining budget trends. On today's webinar, we'll hear from Tina Guarda from the Independent Budget Office, IBO, explaining how New York City's budget works. Some of this may be repetition for some of you, but we want to make sure we're all starting from the same page. Next, Emily Pisano, a Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst here at FPWA, will share information on the Funds Tracker generally, what we are able to determine from the fiscal year 25 data situated in the context of the city's budget historically and in this moment, and ideas for how the city can respond to the present and build for a more resilient and just future. Please drop your questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation. We'll be sure to hold time at the end to answer as many as possible. Before I hand it off to Tina, I want to ground us in the current moment. New Yorkers are struggling. 62% of people in the city are unable to meet the true cost of economic security, meaning they do not have enough resources to meet the costs of daily living, manage debt, and save for unexpected expenses and the future. Beyond that, 25% of New Yorkers are classified as living in poverty in that they do not meet the federal poverty limit. For context, a family of 4 in New York City is considered in poverty if they earn $33,000 or less. And 1 in 7 children in our city and our public school system is currently in temporary housing. We're in a precarious place in which far too many have far too little. And at the same time, as will be explored later, there's excessive wealth in this city. Those at the top are doing extremely well, and the growth has continued at an accelerated pace for many years. At the same time as the new Mamdani administration comes on board with the purpose of ensuring affordability, they're confronted with an estimated $12 billion budget gap for the current and next fiscal year, resulting from the past administration's mismanagement, lack of oversight, and under-budgeting, as well as disinvestments from the current Trump administration and growing costs for goods and services. Our fiscal situation is tenuous and the needs are great. In this webinar, we will explore in greater detail where we are, how we got here, and where we need to go to build economic security for all New Yorkers. Tina?
Hey. So as Madeline said, my name is Tina Guarda. I'm the Chief Outreach and Engagement Officer for the Independent Budget Office, and I'm going to give a bit of a high-level overview of how the New York City budget works and go a little bit into our work in which we also estimate what the gaps might be between what the city receives and what the city spends, but we'll get all into that in just a little bit. So next slide, please. But I want to start off with what is IBO? IBO is a nonpartisan government city agency that at its heart provides information on the budget and on the city services that the budget funds. And we do this in a variety of different ways. The regular analysis that we do is on each of the 3 financial plans, which I'll be getting into in just a little bit, that then culminate into the adopted budget, which is released at the beginning of the fiscal year. But in creating that adopted budget, we start with, there are 3 plans that we analyze we basically provide an independent estimate of the money that New York City is going to expect in revenue between taxes, federal and state funding, and the amount that it expects to spend via the social services it's providing. And we do that after the November plan, which is the last time that we've done this work. We do this for the preliminary plan, which is we're expecting in February, and we do this for the executive budget that is released in May. And we also provide policy reports across the year on where we look at specific programs and how the budget is manifesting through that report. How is the actual management of that program manifesting through the funds that are being used to for those particular policies. And the ones that we've done recently are we've looked at Be Heard, which is the pilot program that sends social workers to mental illness emergency calls in certain precincts. And we've looked at response rates to not evaluate the program, but look at some of the metrics with which we can judge how that program's working. We've also looked at the funding for teachers and class space to see how New York City is doing and complying with the state class size mandate that it has to comply by, I believe it's the 2028-2029 school year. The other thing we do related to those policy reports is we provide testimonies at city council hearings when they're providing oversight for the programs that we have done research on. So we want to inform the conversation around programs that we've looked into through our reports. And the last thing we do is we provide presentations like this one where we try to explain how the budget works. New York City has a very regimented budget schedule. And we do this for community boards and any advocacy organizations that ask us to come in and talk about this. So any of you all here today can ask us for a budget presentation. We also look deeply into people's school budgets. School budgets are something most New Yorkers are come in contact with through their family or their children. And we, just because the budget is available publicly, just because even New York City budget plans are available publicly doesn't mean that they're understandable. And we try to provide that understanding through our presentations. And again, it can be done at request, but we also reach out as much as we can to provide, to just know, let people know that these resources are available. And lastly, I'll say that we also accept research requests. So if there are questions that folks in this webinar have around how certain programs are being run, or you know, if you hear on the ground that certain programs are not running the way that you've seen them being written about, please reach out to us where we can. We will look into a particular policy for you. We are constrained by the data available, but we're very transparent about where we can answer a question and where we can't. So that's about who we are as an agency. Next slide, and then next slide. So I'll get into some of the, again, the budget basics around how the city budget works. So the main actor for the New York City budget is the mayor and the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management Budget manages the city budget throughout the year and oversees agency activities. And the mayor and Office of Management and Budget draft the financial plans that are the negotiating starting point for each budget. They publish a financial plan, and that becomes the plan from which City Council is then going to provide hearings and try to figure out what priorities do they want also reflected in the budget. Because as it says here, the budget at its first published point reflects the mayoral priorities, but hopefully by the end, it also reflects City Council priorities. So on the next slide, we'll think about, I'll talk about a couple of the other actors in the budget space. So we have City Council, who I mentioned. Go back one. We have City Council, I mentioned, who holds hearings via their 35 standing committees, trying to find out what the details of how they expect the budget to manifest in actual services, and then provide feedback on what other priorities they want to see funded. The comptroller provides audits where they're looking at, after a city service has been funded, what are the services the city is actually getting? What's the quality of those services? And they provide recommendations from there. And two things I want to point out is that the comptroller and the City Council also do similar estimates that I mentioned that IBO does. So IBO will estimate by looking at economic activity and past trends, how much the city can expect in revenues, and by looking at past trends in spending for specific city services, how much the city can expect to be spending on those services. And then we compare to the OMB plan to see, are they planning to spend enough? Are they planning to spend too much or not enough? Because something I just want to emphasize is the budget is a plan for spending, but what we do, and what many of us here in this space do, is keep track of how much is being spent to date and where are we overspending based on our initial plan and where are we underspending. And the comptroller and the City Council also do that work. So it's all different data points to try to, get at the truth of what's going to happen in the future. That's what we're all trying to estimate. The other actors in this space are community boards. Community boards are on the ground, listening to the needs of their residents. And in October, they provide what are called annual needs statements, where they submit to agencies needs that they see in the community relevant to that agency. And what they also do in the beginning of the year that we're hearing about now is they look at the preliminary budget after it's been released and see how well did those annual needs statements, like how well does the budget reflect the annual needs statements that they submitted. What we hear on the ground is that very often they don't see those needs, totally reflected, but it is what these community district managers and boards are charter mandated to do. And lastly, I'll talk just real briefly on the New York State Financial Control Board, the FCB. This was an entity created at the end of, in the mid-70s during the New York City fiscal crisis. And currently they monitor each budget, but they're not turned on to really like approve or not approve the budget, but they could if the city ever found itself in a fiscal crisis that it couldn't find its way out of and needed more top-down management. It is a tool that the state can impose on the city. And then there's us who, again, are providing, independent of the mayor, independent of the comptroller, independent of the city council, our own estimates of how the budget plan is working. And on the next slide, I'll talk about the cycle, the budget cycle. So currently, we're in the beginning of February, and we're awaiting the preliminary budget. For the preliminary budget, which will be released in February 17th. It's normally released in January, but with the new administration coming in, that deadline changed, and that changed our deadline as well. So we will be releasing our analysis of that preliminary budget on March 25th. We will testify about it to City Council earlier on March 10th. In May, the executive budget is released. And that's done after the state budget releases their budget, which should be by April 1st, although sometimes it can be late, which then makes it a bit tricky because the city's executive budget is meant to reflect the revenue it expects from the state, given the state budget that's released a month earlier. And after city council hearings, city council votes to adopt the budget for the new fiscal year, which starts on July 1st. And then in November, we have the November plan, which is I think of it as the progress report for how we're doing given the budget adopted in July. Where do we see overspending given receipts that have actually come in? Where do we see revenue that's come in? How is that all shaping up compared to what we thought, what OMB and City Council voted on at the beginning of July? Keep going. Sorry, yeah, there were some animations here, so sorry about that. So what I've been talking about until now is the expense budget, which you'll hear referred to in this webinar as the operating budget. It can be called the program budget or the expense and revenue budget, and that covers our day-to-day expenses, all the, the salaries of city workers and the services that you see every day and small ticket supply items. There is also the capital budget, which funds your big construction projects, anything that costs over $50,000 and has a minimal useful life of 5 years. And in IT projects, it's 3 years. But those are two different budgets that are managed in two different ways. Capital is funded by bonds, i.e. loans, and the expense budget is funded by taxes. And we'll look in a little bit what we mean by revenue for the expense budget. But the important thing to know about the expense budget is that it has to be balanced. So however much money you expect to receive is how much money you're going to spend, and those must be equal by the end of the year by law. Next slide, please. And so this is another way to show that revenues and expenditures have to be balanced. So you'll see that on the left, revenues for in the November plan, we're expected to be at $118 billion, and we expect, given all the amount budgeted for every service, that we will be spending $118 billion. And so when you subtract one from the other, it is zero. But you'll sometimes refer to what's called as the gap, and the gap is where we expect expenses to be more than revenues, and that has to be closed. And so that's where that $12 billion number refers to, and that $12 billion number is what OMB is currently saying that we believe is working off of the November estimate that the comptroller released. but they'll release a new number with the preliminary budget. Next slide, please. So where does New York City get its money? Principally from taxes, property taxes, personal income taxes, business and general sales, and also federal and state grants. And it will be, I'm sure Emily will be getting into how federal grants have been reduced by the One Big Beautiful Bill aid, and that some of the uncertainty around the guarantee that you'll get funds from the federal government is really throwing this whole process into a bit of a disarray. And it affects state funds too, because some of the funding that we get from the state is actually flowed from federal into state. But the 7% number is money that New York City gets in some direct form, way or another, from the federal government specifically. Next slide, please. And then where is the money going? Principally, if you can press next, it'll show up the, yeah. Principally, the category of spending that we spend the most money on is education. It's funny, whenever we ask people, we've tabled Summer Street this summer and asked people to guess what New York City spends the most amount of money on, and it's definitely not education, is not the first guess. But it is education, followed by health and social services, pensions and benefits for city staff, public safety and the judicial system, followed by housing and infrastructure. With housing and infrastructure, much of the money in this space actually flows through the capital budget, because as you can imagine, if you're actually building housing, that is a capital project. And then you'll see it's 4% of the overall budget is the debt service that we pay, which is the principal and interest on the funds, on the loans that are taken out for capital projects. And last but not least, the smallest amount is for parks, libraries, and arts institutions. Next slide, please. Oh, and I do just want to point out that we have on our website resources to look into the budget, and one of the newest ones we have is New York City's budget in $100, where we take the numbers and try to make them and scale them to $100 to make the amounts more understandable, because in the billions it starts to get a bit abstract. But just breaking down a little bit further of how the expenditures are described in budget documents, you have personal services, which is where you'll see your salaries and wages for city staff, the amount spent on pensions, the amount spent on their benefits. And then we have what we call everything else, which is other than personal services. So these are items and operations and maintenance and things of that nature. And then you also have debt service. This here we have what's called budget. Oh, if you can go back just one more time, sorry. We also have budget stabilization, where in previous years, when revenues exceeded expenditures, the revenue that exceeded that expense was used to prepay next year expenses. But as you'll see on the next slide, that's not a cushion that we expect to have for this fiscal year or for the future fiscal years. So this table comes from our November plan analysis, that analysis that I mentioned, where we look at what we expect the New York City to receive in revenue, again, from taxes and state and federal grants and service funds, and what we expect the city to spend on its various services. And for this year, we're expecting a $377 million. We predicted, in any case, a $377 million gap, which is pretty small. But in future years, you'll see that we are estimating fairly large gaps in the billions for fiscal year 27, 28, 29. And based on our analysis of past spending trends and what we expect to see in revenue, we expect a larger gap, a larger deficit than OMB did at the time. But again, I'll remind you that other actors that are also doing this kind of work are City Council and the Comptroller. And these are all, we all use different assumptions to come at this final number. And, we can explain our own assumptions. We don't always know, what are the underlying assumptions in other estimates. But yeah, with that, I will hand it over to Emily.
Thanks, Tina. That was a super helpful overview of the city's fiscal landscape. And I think it did a good job of highlighting some of the current risks that the city budget faces, with that gap that, that Tina just talked about. Before I get into the next portion of the presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to reintroduce myself. My name is Emily Pisano. I'm the Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst at FPWA. And I want to take today to build on the information that Tina presented. Given this moment of budget uncertainty with facing a budget gap, it's important that advocates have an understanding of the broader fiscal landscape. So rather than a snapshot of just current expenses and what is forecasted in out years, instead we need to look at how the budget has evolved over time and how the city's past fiscal choices have created long-term trends that affect its capacity to serve New Yorkers. Um, Sorry, I just skipped. I want to talk about first, actually, that, while we really want to emphasize that this context is super important, we acknowledge as budget advocates ourselves how hard it can be to access and understand budget data, let alone putting it in a wider context. So, in light of that need, FPWA developed its own budget advocacy tool called the New York City Funds Tracker, which tries to break down some of the barriers for analysis. So, what is the New York City Funds Tracker? The New York City Funds Tracker is an interactive budget dashboard that provides a backwards looking view at where the city's budget comes from and where it goes. The idea for this funds tracker work came in response actually to the first Trump administration's grant cuts. Advocates were asking FBWA, what's going on with federal grant cuts and how will it affect human services? Unfortunately, 7 years later, this is again the reality that we're facing. So, since that time in 2019, FPWA has iterated on this funds tracker work. And this year, we've updated our dashboard with the latest complete fiscal year data, adding fiscal year 2025. And just to touch back on what Tina mentioned earlier, is that fiscal years are kind of asynchronous with a typical calendar year. So when we talk about fiscal year 2025, we're talking about the months between July 2024 and June 2025. So we're capturing some of the beginning of the Trump administration, but we're looking about, 6 to 8 months ago. Um, so while we won't be going through a demo of the funds tracker today, I did want to take a moment to highlight some of its functionality. The dashboard draws on comptroller data to allow users to explore budget data over more than a decade. More specifically, we pull on the comptroller's annual comprehensive financial report, as well as Checkbook NYC data, which is the comptroller's open data platform. And we show New York City's actual operating revenues and expenditures. So that means what we're showing is what New York City actually spent, and that may be different than what was budgeted. And we think that's really important because it's what funds are reaching people. So with the latest update, the funds tracker includes data from all the way back from fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2025. The dashboard provides a lot of ways to explore and visualize the budget. So we kind of start with a high-level overview of the city's revenues and expenditures, and you can drill down further into data. You can drill down into revenue data, you can explore federal and state grants, and you can also drill down into expense. You can go into detailed agency spending. There's inbuilt controls. You can dynamically change graphs and you can adjust budgets for inflation, which is, I think, a interesting thing for advocates to put their budget into context for. It allows users to pull quick statistics and visualize trends over time. So there's a lot of functionality and information there, and I'd encourage you guys to go to our website and test the tool yourself. So today, rather than a demo, we'll be drawing on the dashboard data to explore and identify budget trends that are putting investment in our communities at risk. These findings are sort of a teaser for our FY25 New York City Funds Tracker annual report, which will be shared with attendees afterwards. And so you can dive into that as well. So diving right in, looking at the data, what we see is the New York City Funds Tracker reveals some of what is being discussed in the media by the Mamdani administration, other budget analysts. Budget pressures have been mounting for years. At a high level, what we find is that when adjusted for inflation, the city's revenue is actually below prior year revenues. And at the same time, city costs have risen. And this combination of factors creates a fiscal squeeze that, because of how the budget is structured, has a disproportionate impact on human services and low-income New Yorkers. I'm going to dive a bit deeper into how the budget structure works and how it has evolved over time, and how that impacts outcomes for New Yorkers. So diving into the revenue side, and explaining what I mean when I say revenue is down. As noted, over the past few years, New York City's budget has stagnated. You can look at the graph over here to kind of see that trend. These graphs are pulled from the New York City Funds Tracker. Since the pandemic, the city's revenue has shrunk in inflation-adjusted terms by close to $3 billion. So that's, in FY25, the revenue was around 117.7 billion, whereas in fiscal year 2022, this peak right here, it was around 120.8. That's inflation adjusted. So what this means is that the real spending power of the city has shrunk. So the question is, why is the city's revenue stagnating? The short answer is that city's tax revenues have had to make up a larger portion of the city's budget. Over the last decade, the city has received less from the federal government. The decrease in grants has been particularly acute in the last few years, with limited time pandemic funding expiring, as well as new administrations. But we find actually when we dive into the data that this trend in federal grants precedes the pandemic. So in addition to the city's loss of federal funds, the state is also receiving less in federal funding, which is putting pressure on the state's ability to contribute to the city. So while the state has increased its grants to the city over time, it has not filled recent federal gaps. And as the federal and state grants have become less generous, the city has had to rely on growth in the city's tax base. Historically, cities' tax collections have grown fairly steadily, as wealth at the top, has grown substantially. But the city's tax base has become more more precarious, as inequality in New York has reduced the pool of New Yorkers that have essentially sufficient taxable assets to generate, the same amount of revenue growth. These factors have led to slowing of growth in the city's revenue and created potential volatility in future years. I want to dive into more depth on how these shifts appear in each sort of revenue channel, and how they impact services and New Yorkers more directly. Okay, diving into the federal side of things. So overall, federal support in FY25 is down substantially. We actually find there's a decrease of 21%, or around $2.5 billion in inflation adjusted terms. It's important to note that most of that decrease does not account for anticipated federal cuts from HR 1, which was passed in July of 2025, so after the end of FY25. So rather, we see that federal funds decrease because of the end of pandemic funding, in particular for education, as well as long-term challenges from the social safety net funding. I've taken 2 snapshots from the New York City Funds Tracker of grant losses that exemplify these losses. So on the left here, you can see the Federal Education Stabilization Grant, which is an emergency grant that helped buoy the city during the pandemic. With the expiry of this education grant, the city lost over $4 billion in funds in FY25. This posed a unique challenge for the city because while it was time limited, the grant was used to support recurring expenditures from 3K to summer schools and staffing. So the city had to backfill expenses with a combination of other revenue sources. On top of education losses, the city received less from the federal government for TANF. For those who don't know or are not familiar, TANF, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, is the largest social services block grant. It's designed primarily to provide cash assistance, but it actually funds a slew of other safety net programs. And the decrease in FY25 between annual decrease is actually quite significant. Um, in this past year, the city received 31% less than in FY24. And this is actually not due to any direct changes to the federal funding of TANF. The formula has not changed, and it's also not due to a decrease in demand. In fact, by all accounts, demand for TANF supported programs is up in New York City. So this is an area of particular concern for FPWA, just in how it might impact services. Right now, we're not seeing any impacts on how the city is receiving TANF grants from the federal government, influencing how it's funding programs that are supported by TANF. But it should be noted that if billing is essentially the money that's coming in continues to be low, the city could face a real funding challenge paying for already incurred expenses. So at the same time as federal grants fall $2.5 billion in inflation-adjusted terms, state grants increase less than 300 million. Most of that increase was actually mandated. It was by the state's education funding formula called Foundation Aid, which you see here on the right. While education funding helped increase state grants, the state had since amended this formula, which will reduce the growth of foundation grant dollars that the city receives in the current fiscal year that we're in, which is FY26 and beyond. Moreover, while state grants increased overall, the state cut certain grants. So take, for example, the state's funding of preventive services, also a social services block grant. You can see a large decrease here. Preventive services fund a wide range of programs. The program is designed with the intent of preventing children from entering the foster system. And it does that by supporting actually the stability of family households. So it actually supports a lot of programs that are aligned with TANF. It supports alleviation of food and housing security. It focuses on providing material supports like cash assistance or care items related material supports. And in FY25, we find that the state's funding of these services decreased 54%, dropping from 710 million to 325 million. And we can expect further decreases to social services block grants, which could exacerbate losses. So what does this mean? What we see is that grant declines disproportionately impact human services, and this is in part structural. Human services agencies are highly reliant on grant funding. You can see here a breakdown of the cities. This is the state grants, and this is federal grants. So you can see here that human services agencies are highly reliant on grant funding, with ACS, HMH, and HPD getting over half of their funding from federal and state grants. And when agencies lose this grant funding, these impacts are felt most by low-income New Yorkers, not only because they affect services, but also because they undermine the support and the funding of community-based organizations. So community-based organizations, or CBOs, are really the frontline workers for human services. And I just want to put into scale how important they are. There are over 80,000 human service contract workers in the city, primarily workers of color. So when there are less funds for these programs, there are also less funds for CBOs, which may result in job loss and exacerbate economic insecurity. So with the funding loss for services, organizations, and individuals, New Yorkers face greater economic precarity. And this increase in economic insecurity is actually a risk for the city's revenue base, in particular for taxes. So, as touched on by the IBO, taxes make up close to 70% of the city's revenue. And while there has been growth in taxes, a longer-term outlook shows that the city's growth is more precarious today than in previous years. I'm going to touch on a few taxes, and I'm not going to go into all of them, so you'll have to read our report. But the first one I want to focus on is property tax collection, which is the largest source of revenue for the city. It's about 30% of the city's revenue, and property tax collection is down following a decade of steady growth. So in FY25, the city brought in around 35 billion in revenue, which is 3 billion less when adjusted for inflation than this FY21 kind of like pandemic high. Revenue fell initially in response to real estate shifts, particularly in the corporate office space. But while the city's property tax has been recovering, it's around pre-pandemic tax levels now. Growth has slowed, which you can kind of see in this trend line here. So this growth has slowed because of a difference in the interest rate environment. As some of you might personally be aware of, the high mortgage rates are putting pressure on property sales and prices. So while property price growth has slowed, costs for individuals still remain high, with residential mortgage rates reaching 6.1%, kind of inflating the long-term cost of property ownership. So the city's taking in less and less in property revenues, but people are not feeling the benefits of that. And on their personal taxes. And as housing becomes less attainable for individuals, there are inequities in the city's property tax system that are making this unaffordability worse. I'll just mention that there's a lot of good research around property tax, but some of this research actually points to the fact that lower value homes face an effective tax rate that's up to 3 times higher than those worth over $1 million. And those are predominantly Black neighborhoods in New York City, paying higher property tax rates, while whiter areas like Park Slope and the are paying much less. There's a bunch of factors that contribute to this, but basically favor single family homes that can raise the costs of more affordable units in the long term, while also raising less revenue from high property values in New York. So we just want to flag this because we want to be creative as we think about creating sustainable revenue sources in the future. And it's worth exploring how we can make property tax system more equitable in order to ensure both the affordability and the stability of city property. The second largest category of city tax revenue, personal income tax, has also seen volatility in recent years. A lot of the change in tax revenues comes from shifting revenues into a newly created tax, which is called the pass-through entity tax, or PTET. You can see it here in this yellow bit. Essentially, PTET is designed to mimic the SALT deduction. So getting into kind of some tax technicalities, which was initially removed by Trump in 2017 with the first tax changes. The tax creates a process. So the PTET tax created a process by which shareholders and certain partnerships and corporations could deduct state and local taxes from their federal personal income tax liability. And this was there was a state PTET created in the effective FY 2022, and then a city one in FY 23. And it was created with the express purpose to incentivize or high income tax earners to stay in a period where there was concern about tax flight from the state and the city. And so, while this tax is not supposed to affect an individual city tax liability, it creates a complex filing system that has increased administrative burden. It's reduced transparency. You can see that there's actually a lot of volatility in the city's personal income tax collection. And this creates sort of a structural imbalance where we're not able to see what, understand what is the driver of this fall in revenue. There's been some talk about there was some misallocations of revenues, PTAT revenues between the state and the city in this year, which is now back up again. Sorry, the FY24. But we just think that it's this system, this two tax system, creates some structural imbalances, which continues a separate system for the rich. Just want to note that, other states and cities have adopted PTET measures, and some have actually let it expire following new tax rules in 2025, which increase the SALT deduction, so allow basically certain people to deduct $40,000 of local and state taxes, but the city and state have kept theirs in place. So lastly, I'll touch on taxes on corporations. There's multiple streams of tax through which the city collects business taxes. You can see them here on the right. Basically, you'll see here in the light gray, what was called the financial corporation tax, in the blue, a general corporation tax, and in this gray, an unincorporated business tax. In 2015 here, you'll see the state actually changed its tax code and it merged this financial corporation tax into the general corporation tax, creating what's now referred to as the business corporation tax. So just getting those technical terms out of the way. But I think it's interesting to kind of from a fiscal policy perspective, trace the changes in our tax system and how we structure it. And so the business corporation tax is the main source of tax business tax revenue for the city. A majority of the liabilities are collected from Fortune 500 companies, but we actually see in FY25 that the collections are down 2.4%. At the same time, tax collections on businesses are actually up overall. And that's because we saw a large growth in unincorporated business tax, which increased 16% in that FY25 year. And this is really notable because while the unincorporated business tax, which is also called UBT, it actually applies to a wide range of businesses, and that can range from mom and pop shops to individual contractors. It can apply to estates, trusts. And in fact, a majority of the tax liability has historically come from industries like finance and insurance, professional services, legal. And so while it applies to a wide range of businesses, the UBT rate is actually far lower than the corporate tax rate at 4%. So if we look at trends over time, we see that business corporation tax, when we take all these three together, are not growing at the same rate as, as business is growing overall. And, in this context, we just want to shine a light on this kind of disparity and want to encourage the city to increase transparency on UBT liabilities and also on corporate subsidies that, to ensure that we're further examining the equitability of our tax base. So while the city gets a majority of its revenue from taxes, I do want to note some of the non-tax revenue that the city collects. The city collects around 7.5 billion in non-tax sources in FY25. There's a variety of sources. I haven't listed them all here, but I do want to mention a few. So we see here fines and forfeitures. We have a non-governmental grants, or also called private grants. We have licensing and permitting agreements, and we also have transfers from the debt service fund. There's also miscellaneous sources that are not included here. And over time, what we're seeing is actually a decrease in revenue collection of non-tax sources. And actually, in fact, a lot of that is, or part of that is low collection or under collection. In fact, the city has over $1.3 billion. This is self-reported by the comptroller in uncollected fines. From the Environmental Control Board, which governs building, fire safety, and quality of life issues. A majority of these outstanding violations are on construction, they're on unsafe buildings, and there's a lot of violations that are never issued at all. So due to poor collection processes, this might be kind of eroding some of our tax base. A lot of it is actually of that $1.3 billion is not considered collectible because of collection issues, but around 435 million is still reported as collectible by the city. I know I'm speeding through things, but I just also want to talk about private grants. So private grants are raised from individuals, charitable orgs, and corporate sponsors, and they have actually decreased substantially over time. You can kind of look, it's down 22% since FY24, down 56% since FY11, and it's just another place where the rich are contributing less to our public life. So while the city is struggling to sort of like keep its revenue base growing, we face a challenge in investing in all New Yorkers. Today, 3 out of 4 New York families with children are economically insecure, with a median household gap of around $40,000. And that's a huge gap that public services plays an important role in filling. But over the years, providing services that help New Yorkers meet their daily needs and save for the future has also grown with with the gap of economic security. So from the New York City Funds Tracker, I just pulled a few key spending changes that I thought were, kind of exemplified some of how agency spending has changed. And we can see some notable increases in spending around issues stemming from the city's affordability. So over the past decade, the city has, these are all compared against FY11 numbers, except where noted. And over the past decade, the city has spent more on homelessness and maintaining affordable housing. Its costs of healthcare and hospitals have skyrocketed, and at the same time, investments in our public schools is being curbed. So what we see is a transfer of city funds from our public sector, and so public investment in our public schools are being curbed while we're moving a lot more of that money into the privatization of the education system. And so what we see here is a transfer of city funds from our public sector and into a hand of smaller and smaller set of private actors, which has been correlated with an increase in long-term costs over time. And so what this means is that the city is actually struggling to meet need and meet the affordable crisis with adequate spending. In FY25, we in fact see some agencies saw decreases in their budget, highlighting here. And so when we don't invest in agencies, we're not investing in housing, children, economic opportunity. On the flip side, I do want to call out, how we can use the New York City Funds Tracker to not only see where the issues lie or point to the negative trends, but we can also see, where the city has been able to save on costs. So the city's spending on contractual services actually decreased by 18% since FY 2022, in part due to better oversight by the comptroller's office. The city has a campaign to improve procurement processes, and it can further reduce spending on contract adjustments and turnover the more it leans into this campaign. Additionally, the city has been able to take advantage of access to cheaper debt. And so while this basically if you're following, the federal funds rate, they are starting to move that rate down. And so the city can take advantage of its access to cheaper debt. So this might not show up in the costs. It shows up actually as a cost in the operating budget, where it looks, based on how much the city has to finance debt, debt service. But it does allow New Yorkers to have greater capital investments that can help build affordable housing, maintain infrastructure, that, builds new structures for economic security. So to sum up, essentially, what we've talked is that the city has been increasingly constrained in recent years due to worsening volatility and inequality in the city's revenue source collection. And this is before the full impact of Trump's policies. But while I don't want to stay on the doom and gloom side of things, this moment actually affords us a real opportunity to address some of these structural budget issues. We can have sort of a reckoning with how we want to structure our city's revenues and expenditures. And so I want to take a moment to reflect on how some of these trends might inform policy that can stabilize the budget in future years. We've discussed inequalities in the tax base that can be addressed. We can shift property tax burdens. We can increase transparency on personal income taxes. We can make corporations pay their fair share. But we've also highlighted that, the promise of better management. We can hold and collect fines from bad landlords and safety violators. We can continue the procurement and contracting reform, and we can continue to invest in public capacity. And lastly, I think if we take anything away from today's webinar, I really want to underscore that it's important to maintain a fight for economic security, not in spite of budget challenges, but because of them. There's disproportionate burden on lower and middle income New Yorkers is causing the city's revenue to stagnate, and a focus on crisis intervention rather than strategic and structural solutions drives costs up. So we really need everyone's advocacy voices right now. This moment doesn't require austerity. It requires investing in public services and strategically investing in economic opportunity. So I know I have left only a few short amount for questions, but I do want to, answer a few. Madeline, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, both Emily and Tina, for these fantastic presentations and everything you shared with us. Emily, could you go ahead and take the deck down? So one of the questions that we got was, if the city sees that its revenues are less than expected at some point during the fiscal year, what are the tools that the city has to close that deficit by the end of the fiscal year?
I can take that if you want, Emily. That there would be difficult decisions needing to be made. And let me just say that one of the reasons that we have quarterly fiscal plans, fiscal budgets, is to adjust based on when revenues or expenses might change. And in the past, when there have been expected gaps between the amount that's being spent and the amount that's being coming in, the mayors and OMB have established a program to eliminate the gap. So if you hear the word PEG, that is where OMB is asking agencies to cut spending on their services. And that might be, there's a variety of ways that it's really the commissioners of those agencies that are going to have to see, is it cutting certain staff? I mean, is it reducing the level of service that's being provided? That's one tool. There is at some points in the past, there have been the ability to ask for help from the state or the federal government. I leave that up to you to wonder how that would happen at the federal level in the near future. But there has been times when the federal government has stepped in after the fiscal crisis of 2008, during COVID, when there was going to be all these mass expenses because of the health crisis we were going in. So those are some of the tools that are available.
Thank you so much. I think the next one might be for you, Emily. What agencies are being most affected with these cuts?
Yeah, so, we have to contextualize what cuts that you're referring to, which it might be talking about potentially HR1 cuts that we see, at the federal level because the state and city's budget process is still evolving. So what we see in HR1 is that there was large cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. A lot of that is actually affects state grant level, so state budget. Um, Agencies that will have knock-on effects are, agencies that receive and support those support low-income New Yorkers. So we can expect ACS to continue to have budget challenges, um, you know, along with there's a focus on H&H is actually an agency so that's health and hospitals. Well, they actually don't, they're sort of this quasi-public corporation. So they rely, their revenue is actually from Medicaid directly, as they receive patients and they're supported by those expenses. They might have serious impacts to their, certain revenues that those hospitals are taking in, and the city might have to step in to support to ensure that we're able to continue to service low-income New Yorkers that rely on Medicaid or don't no longer have access to that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Someone asked, can you explain what Schedule C is in relationship to the budget?
So Schedule C are discretionary funds that City Council has access to that they often give to local organizations providing services in their communities in small amounts. And they can do this on the expense side. When they do it on the capital side, it's called Reso A. But you can actually go to the New York City Council's website and see the examples of the kinds of projects that they fund. But that is City Council specific and outside of the OMB. It would show up in the budget as a grant to that City Council person, and the City Council person would then decide how to use that money.
Thank you so much. We do still have some more questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. I want to again thank you, Tina and IBO, for coming with FPWA and sharing all this really useful information about how the budget works, how the process happens, and what we can learn from it. Emily, I know we have some information forthcoming if you want to pop back on and let people know what to expect in the next few days.
Yeah, so you can expect to receive our FY25 annual update report in follow-up. You can go on our website to view the New York City Funds Tracker, play with it. And we also have a lot of other sources on our, resources on our website where you can learn more about, how the budget is evolving with a focus on how it impacts human services. And so, stay tuned for more.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.